Alfred Nobel was a well-known inventor and businessman in his time. But it is through the Nobel Prizes outlined in his last will and testament that his name lives on today. In a single page, Nobel created a document that would link his name to the achievements of the world in science, literature, and the causes for peace. Despite his success as inventor and businessman, Alfred Nobel suffered from frequent bouts of melancholy. He had a growing business empire, but he had no family of his own. Gradually, he began thinking of creating a prize that would stimulate scientific progress and help improve human conditions. In the autumn of 1895, Alfred Nobel wrote the final provisions of his third and last will in his home in Paris. He later signed it in the presence of 4 Swedish witnesses at the Swedish-Norwegian Club. Nobel wrote his will without the help of a lawyer. Little did he know that this would cause enormous complications in the future. On December the 10th, 1896, Alfred Nobel died of a heart attack in his home at San Remo, Italy, surrounded only by servants who did not understand the rumblings of the dying man. 3 people closely connected to him, his nephews Emanuel and Hjalmar Nobel, and his personal assistant Ragnar Solman, held a simple ceremony before his remains were sent to Stockholm to be cremated and buried in a northern cemetery. Nobel was 63 years old and had lived alone most of his life. He would leave his legacy to the world. 5 days after his death, the contents of Alfred Nobel's last will were made known. After assigning carefully specified legacies to his relatives, Nobel wrote, "The capital invested in safe securities by my executors shall constitute a fund, the interest in which shall be annually distributed in the form of prizes to those who during the preceding year shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. The interest from the fund shall be divided into 5 equal parts. 1 part shall be awarded to the person who shall have made the most important discovery or invention within the field of physics. 1 part to the person who shall have made the most important chemical discovery or improvement. 1 part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery within the domain of physiology or medicine. 1 part to the person who shall have produced, in the field of literature, the most outstanding work of an idealistic tendency. And 1 part to the person who shall have done the most or best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses." Finally, Nobel wrote that the nationality of the candidates was not to be considered. Nobel entrusted the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences to choose the prize winners for physics and chemistry. The awarding of the prize in physiology or medicine was assigned to Karolinska Institutet. For literature, he entrusted the Swedish Academy, and for the Peace Prize, he assigned a committee elected by the Norwegian Storting, or Parliament. Why did Alfred Nobel choose these fields? The will does not give us any answers to this question, but they may be found in the testator's own life. As inventor and entrepreneur, Alfred Nobel had personal knowledge of the importance of physics and chemistry for technological progress. All his life, he not only devoted his efforts to taming the power of nitroglycerine, his efforts also extended to various fields in chemistry, such as in his efforts to produce synthetic rubber, leather, artificial silk, and many more. Nobel had a strong interest in the medical sciences, which he documented in several ways. In 1890, he established in Sèvres, outside of Paris, a medical research laboratory dealing with problems related to blood transfusion. The prize for literature is an extension of his boyhood interest. Nobel seriously contemplated becoming a writer. He was inspired by Lord Byron and the poet Shelley, and their influence can be traced in Nobel's own stilted effort at a play entitled Nemesis. As for the Peace Prize, Nobel had always been interested in the cause of world peace. This was made stronger through his friendship with the peace activist Bertha von Suttner, who had worked with Nobel for a very short period of time, and who obviously left a strong impression on him. Alfred Nobel named Ragnar Sohlman and Rudolf Liljeqvist as executors of his will. Sohlman was a chemical engineer employed by Alfred Nobel as his personal assistant in 1883 after he moved to San Remo, Italy. Rudolf Liljeqvist was a civil engineer who had launched an electrochemical company with the financial assistance of Nobel. The will drew mixed reactions from different quarters of Swedish society. Nobel's relatives deeply resented the inadequacy of their inheritance. They had grave fears that the sale of Nobel's shareholdings in the Nobel brothers' naphtha company in Russia would threaten their financial position. The academies, named as awarding bodies, were reluctant about their role since Alfred Nobel left no specific instructions on how the prizes were to be awarded. There was political concern about the Peace Prize being handled by a committee appointed by the Norwegian Parliament, since moves were underway to dissolve the union of Sweden and Norway. While most of the Swedish newspapers were one in praising Alfred Nobel, leading politicians and conservative and left-wing papers called him unpatriotic and accused him of bypassing Swedish interests in favour of international activities. Rudolf Liljeqvist's work at his factory did not allow him to get away for more than a few days at a time. Ragnar Sohlman had to take on the responsibilities of executor, while Liljeqvist offered advice and moral support. In France, Ragnar Sohlman devised a way to transfer Nobel's important papers to Sweden without being detected and stopped by the French tax authorities and Nobel's relatives. In a brilliant manoeuvre, hardly expected of a 25-year-old, Sohlman managed to take out the papers from the banks and personally transported them in a horse-drawn carriage to the Gare du Nord station. Ragnar Sohlman had a gun at the ready as he escorted Nobel's papers, worth several millions, through the streets of Paris. The papers were safely shipped to Stockholm before the French tax authorities or Alfred Nobel's relatives could get hold of them. Was Alfred Nobel's will legally valid? Only the proper court could decide over its fate. A French court would lose no time in exposing the legal flaws of the will. A Swedish court, on the other hand, would be more lenient. Nobel's residence became a crucial issue. Called in jest the richest vagabond in Europe, Nobel was not registered as resident in any country since he and his family moved to Russia when he was 9 years old. He had claimed that his home was where his work was, and indeed he had acquired several houses in Europe. In Germany, Nobel lived in a simple home, close to his factory in Krümmel. When he was in Scotland, his residence was Hawthorne Cottage in Lauriston. He lived for 18 years in his Parisian mansion and made it his permanent home, before he was forced to move to San Remo, Italy, in 1887. The last property Alfred Nobel bought before his death was Björkborn Manor in Bofors, Sweden. The stable of horses that Nobel had in Björkborn helped convince the French that Nobel was indeed a resident of Sweden. The ball was now in the hands of the Swedish court, and another major obstacle was out of the way. The next step was to convince the academies to accept their role as prize awarders. With the help of Carl Lindhagen, their legal advisor, the executors sent a letter on March the 24th, 1897, to the concerned institutions, requesting them to accept the role as prize-awarding bodies. The Norwegian Parliament agreed, but the academies in Sweden hesitated. A campaign was now raging in the local press to influence public opinion against Alfred Nobel's will. A series of leading articles published in the paper Vårt Land argued that the will was not acceptable on formal grounds. The authors pointed out that the provisions violated the laws of inheritance, were manifestly unpatriotic, and had to be condemned on moral grounds. Stormy debates echoed in the halls of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Swedish Academy and Karolinska Institutet. Those who were opposed argued that accepting the task would be bad for Swedish research and would negatively affect the institutions. The prevailing mood was to wait and see until the will was validated. The executors were now forced to talk with Alfred Nobel's relatives and to address their demands. Alfred Nobel's nephew Ludwig had, by this time, initiated sequestration procedures against his uncle's properties in France, Germany and England. But there were cracks in the family's opposition to the will. Another nephew, Emanuel, who represented the Russian Nobel family, supported his uncle's will and did not wish to contest it. His only concern was to keep the Nobel family's shareholdings in the Nobel Brothers Naphtha Company based in Russia. His position was not easy. Pressure on Emanuel to dispute the will was exerted by influential circles in Stockholm. Emanuel was summoned to an audience with King Oscar II of Sweden, who tried to convince him to get the terms of the will changed, especially the clause about the Peace Prize. The king asserted that the prize would only cause trouble, since there were moves to dissolve the union of Norway and Sweden. Emanuel refused to be pressured, and instead used his influence to soften the attitude of his cousins. He also encouraged Ragnar Sohlman to persevere, telling him that the word executor in Russian meant vicar of the soul. The executors managed to reach an agreement with the family such that certain legacies were given to private individuals named in the will, but the battle for the rest of the estate was not yet over. A year had already passed, and the executors were still stuck with the refusal of the academies to cooperate and the continued opposition of Alfred Nobel's family to the will. It was time to take in a third party. Through the suggestion of their legal advisor, the executors sent a memorandum to the Attorney General requesting the involvement of the Swedish government in having the will declared legally valid. On May the 21st, 1897, the Attorney General handed down his legal opinion that, although no direct interests of the Crown were involved, as the donation had been made by a Swedish subject for public purposes, it was appropriate that the government assist in putting the testator's wishes into effect. On May the 25th, 1897, the Swedish Academy signified its willingness to discuss matters with the executors. Karolinska Institutet sent a positive reply a day after. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences refused to budge from its wait-and-see attitude. Emanuel Nobel's influence became a major factor in convincing the Nobel family to cooperate with the executors. After negotiating for the transfer of shares in the Naphtha Company on behalf of the family, Emanuel promised he would help the executors in negotiating with the rest of the Nobel clan, provided that alterations and supplementary provisions of the will would be produced only with the consent of all the major Nobel heirs. Continued discussions with the rest of the noble family resulted in a series of agreements in late May and early June 1898. The Nobel heirs dropped their suits in return for payments of about 1 million crowns over and above the legacies made in the will. These agreements also provided that the statutes common to all prize-awarding bodies should be drawn up in consultation with representatives of the Nobel family. In late 1898, the settlement was accepted by all the prize-awarding bodies. The government endorsed it on September 9th, 1899, clearing the way for the official negotiations over the statutes of the Nobel Foundation. On June 29th, 1900, a royal ordinance was handed down establishing the statutes of the Nobel Foundation, as well as the special regulations governing the Swedish prize-giving committees. On December 10th, 1901, 5 years after Alfred Nobel's death, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded in Stockholm and in Oslo. For the executors, especially Ragnar Solman, who had shouldered much of the work to fulfill Alfred Nobel's last will and testament, the long struggle was finally over. The predictions about the dangers and difficulties that would result from the implementation of Nobel's will were proven groundless. The Nobel Foundation and the distribution of the prizes have extended knowledge and respect for Sweden and Swedish culture throughout the world. Today, the Nobel Prizes have become an institution and a symbol of the system whereby scientists, in particular, are offered recognition and reward for excellence by their peers.